Welcome to Agency Nation Radio, powered by The Big I, where we ask insurance professionals to turn on the mic and share successes, challenges, and the stories that made them the professionals they are today. I'm your host, Kasey Connors, the Executive Director for the Agents Council for Technology, and I'm excited today to be joined by Jenn and Niji Sabharwal, co-founders of AgentSync. Jenn is AgentSync CTO, originally built the foundation of the company to help solve producer licensing compliance challenges in insurance. And Niji, AgentSync CEO, helped shape the vision after firsthand seeing the impact of breakdowns in the industry during his time at Zenefits. Together, they've built AgentSync into a company helping modernize compliance and connectivity across the insurance ecosystem. Jenn and Niji, thank you so much today. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Cool.
thanks for having us. We're excited for this.
Awesome. I'm excited too, because I think, compliance, connectivity, how technology can simplify, incredibly complex processes is things we talk a lot about at ACT. And I think, you guys are some that saw some major industry challenges and decided to build something on it. So before we dive in, let's get to know each other a little bit better. What really sparked the idea for AgentSync?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we're married, by the way. I don't know if that was clear when we set this up. So we live in San Francisco. I was working at a company called Zenefits. We ran into a ton of regulatory issues around producer licensing compliance, and didn't know that much about it at the time, and kind of learned the hard way of, what not to do, and really like the complex nature of the way that insurance is regulated in the U.S., everything being state-based and kind of not having a ton of uniformity. So we got in a ton of trouble over this stuff. Worked with our kind of government relations and compliance team to really get our arms around the issue. We ended up kind of open sourcing a version of the, you can think about AgentSync V1, way back when, where we open source a version of the technology to help brokers kind of stay compliant as a free kind of outsourced app. And then we were not expecting to see so much traction, but we saw a ton of traction, and a bunch of light bulbs went off that in my head that this thing is a real problem to solve, and kind of roped Jenn into it at that point. And Zenefits was gracious enough to sign the IP for the idea over to me. And then once we got through the woods with the regulatory issues, kind of Jenn and I went head first in the wonderful world of kind of producer onboarding and really how to activate distribution channels effectively.
Awesome. That's fun. That's a big, I saw you guys you met at LinkedIn. I did have that tidbit was shared over. That's cool. And then I guess what has surprised either of you about just the insurance industry's kind of evolution over the last couple of years?
I'll take that. So as was sort of implied, I knew nothing about insurance when I dove into this. I knew enough about what had happened over the dinner table, and then I was handed the spec for NIPR, and my first question was, "What's a carrier appointment?" So that was back in 2018. But I think one of the things coming in maybe with a new set of eyes, so that we observed really in this space was, I think back in 2018 when we came to market, there was some amount of interest in self-serve and evolving the agent experience. But that wasn't really top of mind. A lot more of the conversations were about that back office and back office processing. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about, because it's something that I'm passionate about and Niji's passionate about, is really thinking about these workflows from the agent experience. What does it look like to be an agent at a very small agency, at a mid-sized agency, anywhere in the ecosystem, working with an MGA, working through these different complex distribution models? And there's a lot more attention to that we hear just talking with folks throughout the industry. I think that's really picked up a lot more in a meaningful way of how do we meet agents where they are and really understand their challenges and make this more of a seamless process. In the last maybe 3 years, 8 years ago, it was a bit of a, hey, what do you think about this? And I was like, neat idea. And now it's we really want to think about this, but we really need to think about how technology is going to help that experience. And we're going to meet that population that's evolving really quickly where they are. So I find that exciting. It gives us a lot more to work on in this space. I think as a collective, right? It's not just about all the state rules. It's really about what does it look like for any given agent to go through an onboarding experience with a partner and how does that get them ready to go do their actual job, which is selling insurance.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, the agents, just the industry has evolved so much lately, and technology can be overwhelming, and a lot of things, are happening at once. But we also talk a lot about growth, and, agencies are strapped for hiring or more producers, or getting more markets, or, getting more distribution. So what would you say is maybe a conversation we're not having about what's holding, maybe growth back?
Yeah. So yeah, I can take a stab at that one. As you think about, the job's changed so much over the years. I think it's probably like one of the harder times to be a broker, for a variety of reasons. But things have changed so much, and it's going to be just absolutely critical that we make it really easy for new brokers to kind of get excited about the profession, jump in. And like one of the things that's a little bit alarming is if we look at the average age of the brokers dropping pretty fast, right? As there's just kind of M&A and roll-ups that are happening, but the broker population is not really getting like replaced at the same rate, and so that age is dropping pretty quickly. So there's just a different expectation of when you start a new job, you should be able to kind of hit the ground running and be off to the races. But if you look at typical agency, it's recruiting a new broker, the process to get them onboarded and to get them market access and appointing with carriers and contracted and licensed and all the continuing education, it's a lot, right? And if we don't make it really easy for everyone to go and kind of run through that and then get on the phones right away, we start to see this drop off, right? Where looking at stats, something like it's like 30% of new brokers who start end up bailing within the first 90 days, and the number one reason they cite is really like the agency onboarding as well as the carrier onboarding. That's a big problem for the entire industry, right? If we don't have these trusted advisors to rely on, we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And I think, with that too, from there's there's an infrastructure gap. There's, rethinking distribution from the ground up. There's, versions of modernization, layering new tools on old processes that causes some issues in that. I think a lot of agents are grappling with that. But, how, when you think about things from agencies looking at, from just overall transformation versus something that's being refreshed, how can you tell the difference in that, and what, maybe an issue of how that maybe trickles down to agents too?
It's a really good question. This feels like let's see if I can take that. I think one of the things that we appreciated when we were bringing product to market is we can all aspire to a future. What does that future look like? A fully automated future. Now we have a world of AI, maybe a fully agentic future, not fully in selling insurance, but maybe in that art of getting someone on board. What would it look like if I could empower that process with new technology? I think there is a reality of what does it take to get from where we are today to your point about existing processes and not just layering on to make that jump. And so we've thought about this from a product perspective of how do we meet you where you are, make that current state significantly better, and then bridge that into a much faster onboarding experience. But there is a bit of like really understanding that problem statement on the ground. And so when we think about it, I think about, putting myself in the shoes of someone who is supporting a team of agents, and they're already to the wall every day. Like they're not sitting there waiting to do a digital transformation. So I think nor do they necessarily have, 4 extra hours in the day. They barely have, all the working hours that they're doing, plus probably some life, hopefully. So I think, when we think about how this is going to change in the industry, I think a lot of it is going to need to be technologies that can slot into how someone's working today and immediately start relieving their workload versus need a really big lift to get them onto a new stack, because where are we going to find the time, right? A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to be on in a conversation with some agency owners, and they said, we've done the math. It's better for us to have someone swivel chair than to take someone off the floor to try to overhaul all of our processes. And I think we all need to think about that, which is there's a bunch of really amazing technology, but there's also the facts on the ground. We have fewer people doing more. They aren't always going to have all the hours in the day. So as technologists, how can we augment them so they can get more breathing room, so that they can lean into the next thing, so they can get more breathing room, and so we can start to shift the mix. But I think it is not going to ever be a snap your fingers and you go from, manual PDFs to fully agentic workflow. So I think we're in a window of time that's pretty exciting in the next 2 to 3 years of how do people go through that journey and who's successful and what does that look like for someone to take that leap. But it is realistically not an overnight leap.
Yeah. And I think kind of touching on what you just said and what Niji said earlier, just about the workplace in general and the next generation of talent, I think, just stereotypically, future talent is coming out of schools that are leveraging technology at a faster rate. It's integrated in what they're doing. Maybe they're used to having just in general less friction points. As if you come in our industry, there's a lot of friction points in the channel. So I think, how do you think, that makes it harder to compete for people just like who have less options? And I think that translates to even just the kind of like things your product is trying to solving.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So, I think one of the like the huge roadblocks here is just the time from when you go recruit somebody and just get them excited to, when they can actually write their first piece of business. And, if you think about like competition as far as like, does that agent, assuming a new agent wants to work in insurance and become an agent, they're likely going to choose between maybe like a captive or independent. And if you're an independent, a captive, things are like a little more straightforward, right? It's usually single carrier, single state or like 1 or 2 states. And then you have usually a team supporting you, right? And so those folks can get up and running and, start earning commissions like in 10 days versus independent who starts, they go through the whole process. They start all the carrier applications across, it's like 12 different carriers, and they don't see their first one for like 45 days, right? And then there's just a bunch of back and forth on paperwork and like just a bunch of admin for them to get, from when they start to first piece of business written. And they're going to be sitting on their hands, kind of shadowing someone for 2 months before they start seeing any commissions, right? And so that is a massive problem that's going to require like a sea change, honestly, to really solve fully. And so that's, like, not to be too salesy, but that's why we exist, right? Is to connect brokers with products to sell, or at least connect distributors with underwriters. And one of the ways we've tried to solve this, or when we came to market, was we're like, okay, this process sucks today, right? As we entered and really evaluated all the steps, there's a lot of paper. Like, even if you're using a kind of an old school like legacy system, it's still very painful, right? And then there's like it's always like a 2-side transaction. You're doing a bunch of stuff at the agency side and a bunch of stuff on the carrier side. And so we went to go solve that problem to build just a much more modern experience, right? We saw all the different workflows and we created, just like nicer user experience and like just prettier screens, I'd say, to go solve that problem. And, right away we were able to create a ton of value for our customers. And we have about half our customers are agencies, and the other half like agencies and MGAs, and the other half are carriers. So we have this really interesting vantage point between the two parties and really understand what goes into onboarding, right, on both sides and what's important to both sides. And it's a bit of a black box, right? You throw a piece of paper over the fence and you're like hoping for them to throw you something back at some point. But anyway, so the reason we exist is to make that process a lot easier. And we started out kind of just building, just better workflow, and that created a ton of value. But, that's not going to be good enough for the next few years, right? As this transformation happens where, everyone's going to have to do a lot more with fewer people. And that's where technology comes in a huge way, right? Where, we're coming out with some really exciting, kind of like a new product at the end of this year. And that process that we talked about is we're not just making a kind of a better workflow, but changing the way this can work by, an agent starting a process and getting fully appointed on the other end within a couple minutes, right? And having that happen real time. Usually when a broker has time to do this, it's going to be Friday night, right, at like 8 or 9 p.m. And so, as they go through this, like, we are building technology that's, it's not just a technology thing. We have to convince carriers and really the broader industry that they have to sacrifice some things, right? Like they can't have an onboarding form, or they shouldn't have an onboarding form. It's like 72 questions, right? And it's just the same information over and over again. And so, we're partnering with a ton of really forward-thinking carriers that realize that, and like, hey, we want to make it really easy for our brokers to work with us. We're realizing producer experience is really terrible for them right now. And so they're willing to kind of do things they weren't willing to before to make sure they make it easy for brokers to start selling their products. And that's the sea change that needs to happen. And it's not AgentSync building technology. It's everyone coming together and saying, this process is not great, and we want to make it a lot easier. We have to make it a lot easier. And we just got to kind of like knock it out domino by domino.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of change in this space right now, but I think how much of the industry do you think still is running maybe on distribution or processes that were designed even for a world that might not be existing right now, or is soon not to be hopefully not existing? You have an opinion on that?
I'd say north of 85%. It's really. But what I would say, and I would say that the appetite to change is increasing, and the understanding of the need to change more quickly is increasing. So I'll take those as positive signals. Yes, there is a lot of process that still, reflects an older world model. But the way that, recently when we're even talking to folks on both sides, on the carriers and the agencies, maybe carriers historically have been slower to change. There's a lot of interest and appetite to say, hey, how can we use new technologies to speed this up? We don't have 5 years to gut an entire system and do a giant digital transformation. We'll lose our reputation in the market with that. And so that's fun because we've had, an advantage, especially with some early movers, more tech forward players in the space. We get to see what they're doing, and there's some really cool stuff happening there. That's been the minority, but I do appreciate in conversations that I get to be in, and especially with IT sides of the house now too, there's a lot more appetite to say, what does it look like in a world where we have, to Niji's point, real-time events where I can see that an agent onboarded and I can do an analysis that can give them a response, in real time. And that wasn't a conversation as actively engaged in even 2 years ago. So I think the speed at which we'll see that appetite to change is coming. But to Niji's point, everyone's going to pull together. Like, it's not one party that's going to make it happen. The carriers are going to have a huge play in that and how they operate internally and what do they want to do in response to the demands of distribution.
Makes sense. I guess when you think about, say, 10 years from now, what does the distribution relationship between carriers and agents, or just in the industry, look like if, as we modernize, like, what's the ideal future state?
This is like you mentioned Niji and I met when we were both working at LinkedIn, and LinkedIn had an idea back then of you should be known as an individual with your career. Right before LinkedIn, those of us who remember that, right, we didn't have a digital representation of ourselves that was singularly us. You were sending resumes off Wednesday, Tuesday. Maybe if you were senior enough in your career, you had access to a headhunter or something like that. But I think there's an opportunity in the industry to really see and appreciate and create experiences all the way down to the agent level that technology will unlock. So one of the things that I get excited about is there are a lot of different models of distribution that could happen in the future that historically haven't been accessible because it is a lot of process, right? It is a lot of management. You have to think about structures that allow for throughput with carriers that are managing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of agents potentially, right? They have all these structures that help them do that. I think it's an interesting thing to contemplate. What does it mean in a world where I can potentially open up access more broadly because I can use technology to understand who that specific agent is. They can have their identity in the space, and that identity can get their access to more and more through their agency, through an MGA, through a partner, or directly with the carrier. So I got really excited about that idea of what those future experiences could look like empowered by technology and what that could mean for future agents. If we take that sea change and move away from some of the old patterns and start to think about how to leverage modern rails to have more personal experiences and to provide better opportunities to those who really want to participate in the insurance space and are really excited about it. Like, how do we get those people the best experiences possible? So that's going to come down to how well does the carrier know you as the agent, not just your agency. So I think a lot about that. It gets me really jazzed about a potential future. And Niji probably have another take on it too.
Yeah, I think like so much is going to have to change, right, in order to support just the amount of changes in the industry, the producer population, and there's an insane amount of technology available out there that you don't have to have a ton of spend a ton of cash on huge enterprise license to do a lot of this these days. Things are starting to move more, move more into commodities and make it more accessible for someone to slap credit card down. It's like $5 a month to access whatever the thing is, and the industry overall is kind of has like an issue around trying to optimize everything almost like for each player in the space, right? It's like the entire industry and like distribution specifically relies on a bunch of parties to make it work, right? Even just thinking about agencies and carriers, like carriers rely on independent agencies. A majority of their premium comes from, not just P&C, like industry-wide, comes from these independent agents and agencies, and they rely on them to write business, especially like within kind of smaller communities, and having the agency rely on the carrier to get products to sell and really to be able to put the best products in front of their customers. It's there's market access issues. There's just this huge amount of overhead that goes into not just what we do and really activating a distribution relationship and all of the compliance and onboarding and contracting that goes into it, but industry wide, there's just so many steps that everyone has to waste time on because everyone's kind of trying to reinvent the wheel. And so one of the big things that we're really starting to see and something we're really focused on is just creating as much self-serve as possible across the industry, right? Kind of everything, every time, even if you like before AgentSync, if you reach out to a carrier to get an appointment, most of it's over email, right? And you're going back and forth and you're kind of at the bottom of the line every time you respond. And so there's just so much time wasted. And, the kind of the carrier admin on the other side, they're working their butt off, right? And they're trying to get to all these requests, but they're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. There's a lot of obviously manual repetition in this space, but in this new world when technology is so much more available, and with AI, you can spin up these solutions like really quickly. And so we're starting to see this where you can go and self-serve, where you can request an appointment, a product to sell, a new state you want to sell into, in a much easier way without a human having to be on the other side, kind of going back and forth and back and forth. So that's going to have to accelerate for sure over the next few years, so that we could catch everything up at the same rate.
Makes sense. And I love that. I mean, your guys' passion comes through visibly when you're talking about it, and just cool from it that it's carried over and what you've done, and really solving a problem, and you see that for the future. So I guess to kind of wrap up with our last question, what do you think is the most important thing? You've kind of touched on this a little bit, in talking about what the channel in general needs to do. But, for over the next 2 years, what should the independent agency channel do to make sure distribution is really a growth engine and not a bottleneck, and so that we can get to this, better state?
I mean, off the bat, they should buy our software, of course.
Step one, reach out to AgentSync.
Yeah, I could take like a quick first crack at it. So, I think like figuring out ways to have more buying power as a group, right? If you look at like the mega brokers, they, command a bunch of, they get to throw their weight around with carriers. And if you like think about it, an agency has 10,000 brokers, for example, they have a ton of weight and a ton of sway with their carriers, where if you group all the independents together, they are much, much bigger, right? And so that you start to see that through like aggregators, but obviously taking like 30% off the top is not ideal. And so one area that we're kind of going is to try to elevate the independent agent so that they have more visibility. They're not just like a line item in a spreadsheet, but they're they have a profile, right? And they can really band together to use just the size of the independent channel to their advantage to just get much better buying power. I don't know exactly what that answer is, but that getting to that point is just going to be massive for being able to really throw their weight around in the way that they that they can or really deserve to.
Yeah, and I think thematically, when you ask that to that point, we had a client who shared with us, and it was really interesting. They have a big sway with their carrier partners, but one of the things that they made a point to do is use that to rate for their carrier partners by partner how they saw them in terms of their onboarding and how they saw them in terms of their complexity working, and really making that producer experience known and really telling the carrier partners, hey, I work with 50 of you. Here's my top 10 that I want to work with, that I want my agents to work with based on how they treat me and my agents when we go through the onboarding process. And I think back on that one because it was the insane internally, probably going to be a lot of work to pull that together and really think about that and get in the right room. But I do think figuring out those ways, wanting to band together, but to continuously bring that data back and bring that data back in a way that can change perspectives. So, maybe have something catch fire a little bit internally with a partner is going to be an important part of this because it is multiple parties at play to make it happen. So I think in a world also with a lot of our new technology, like how do you think about monitoring those things and how do you give that feedback more effectively, either as an individual or as a group? Because we now have the ability to do that with those partners, and that will hopefully help tip the scale a little bit in some of the process side.
I think elevating it, even if it's sometimes not what to hear, it's moving things forward to get better for everybody. So we thank you so much for being partners of the Big I and the Agents Council for Technology. And if you haven't heard about AgentSync, you can go check them out as they're trying to revolutionize, and remove some friction points in the industry. So thank you, Jenn and Niji. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And yes, thank you for tuning in to this edition of Agency Nation Radio, powered by the Big I and Trusted Choice. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to hit the subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. And if you have a story for Agency Nation Radio, please contact us at hello@agencynation.com.